Imagine surviving on your own at 12 years old. Now imagine doing it in the unforgiving wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. And then, imagine sharing your makeshift home with a wild bear cub. This isn't fiction. This is the extraordinary true story of Sarah Miller, who in 1892 faced unimaginable tragedy, fled into the mountains, and formed one of the most remarkable human-animal bonds ever documented. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today, we uncover how a girl orphaned by violence found an unlikely family in the wild, and how that relationship changed the course of history. This is a tale of survival, transformation, and a connection that defied everything we thought we knew about the boundary between humans and wild animals. The fading light of October 7th, 1892, cast long shadows through the pine trees surrounding the Miller family cabin. Sarah stood at the edge of the small creek that gave Timber Creek its name, gathering water for the evening meal. At 12 years old, she was already adept at the chores that frontier life demanded. Her father, Thomas Miller, had moved the family from Philadelphia just 8 months earlier, trading his career as a wildlife illustrator for the raw beauty and isolation of the Colorado Rockies. Her mother, Elizabeth, a former schoolteacher, now homeschooled Sarah between tending their small garden and preserving food for the approaching winter. Sarah paused, listening to the distant cry of an eagle echoing across the valley. This place felt more like home than the crowded city streets ever had. Here she could explore for hours, cataloging plants in the small leather-bound journal her father had given her for her 12th birthday. The wilderness wasn't something to be feared, but embraced. At least that's what her father always said. Thomas Miller had come to document the remarkable wildlife of the region, particularly the dwindling bear population that had fascinated him since childhood. His detailed illustrations of local flora and fauna were sent monthly to the Denver Natural History Society, part of a growing conservation movement spreading across America's shrinking frontiers. "Sarah!" her mother's voice carried from the cabin. "Supper's nearly ready!" Sarah filled the second bucket and began the short trek back, careful not to spill the precious water. The evening had turned suddenly cooler, the kind of sharp temperature drop that often preceded storms in these mountains. Dark clouds gathered above the distant peaks, promising a long night of rain and wind. As she approached the cabin, the warm glow of lamplight spilled from the windows, a beacon of comfort against the darkening wilderness. The scent of her mother's venison stew made her stomach growl with anticipation. Inside, the small cabin was warm and fragrant. Her father sat at his desk in the corner, his broad shoulders hunched over his latest drawings. The walls were adorned with his completed works, intricate renderings of elk, mountain lions, eagles, and his favorite subject, bears. He claimed the bears of these mountains possessed an intelligence and complexity most people refuse to acknowledge. "They're not so different from us," he often told Sarah during their expeditions. "They love their young, they mourn their dead, they remember those who've wronged them." "Storm's coming," Sarah announced, setting the water buckets by the stove, where her mother stirred the bubbling stew. Elizabeth Miller tucked a strand of auburn hair, the same shade as Sarah's, behind her ear. "Your father's been saying the same thing, though I suspect he means more than weather." She glanced meaningfully toward Thomas, who remained absorbed in his work. Sarah moved to peer over her father's shoulder. The illustration showed a female grizzly and her cub, rendered with such precision that they seemed alive on the page. But beside the drawing lay something unusual, a crude map marked with red X's, and a list of names Sarah didn't recognize. "What's that, Papa?" she asked. Thomas quickly covered the paper with his drawing. "Nothing for you to worry about, Starlight." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, which had grown more troubled in recent weeks. He'd been making frequent trips deeper into the mountains, returning. Late and tight-lipped, Sarah had overheard her parents arguing in hushed tones after they thought she was asleep, something about evidence and authorities and dangerous men. The first crack of thunder shook the cabin windows. Elizabeth lit additional lamps as darkness fell completely, closing the heavy wooden shutters against the coming storm. The family gathered around the small table, saying grace before diving into the hearty stew. For a while, the only sounds were the clink of spoons against bowls and the increasing intensity of rain hammering the roof. Despite the warmth of the cabin, Sarah couldn't shake a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the storm. "I encountered some men near the northern ridge today," Thomas finally said, breaking the silence. "They claimed to be hunting elk." Elizabeth's hand stilled with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "And were they?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "They had bear traps and skinning knives, no elk rifles." He glanced at Sarah, then back to his wife, a silent message passing between them. "I think they followed me for a while on my return." "Thomas," Elizabeth whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Perhaps we should reconsider." "I've nearly completed the documentation," he interrupted. "The territorial magistrate needs to see what's happening in these mountains. These aren't legal hunters. They're slaughtering the bears for Eastern fashion markets. Cubs orphaned, sows killed while denning." His fist clenched on the table. "We came here to make a difference, Elizabeth." Sarah's appetite vanished. She'd seen her father's documentation, the mutilated carcasses, the empty dens, the abandoned cubs that rarely survived without their mothers. Thomas Miller wasn't just illustrating wildlife. He was building a case against poachers who operated with impunity in the region's remote areas. Elizabeth reached across the table to take her husband's hand. "Your work matters, Thomas, but Sarah matters more." She turned to Sarah with a forced smile. "Finish your stew, dear. Then perhaps your father will read another chapter of that adventure, novel you both enjoy so much." The evening progressed with a strained normalcy. Thomas read aloud from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, while Elizabeth mended clothing by the fire. Sarah tried to lose herself in the story, but couldn't ignore how her father paused at every unusual sound from outside, or how her mother's eyes repeatedly drifted to the loaded rifle mounted above the door. When it was time for bed, Sarah climbed the ladder to her small loft. Through the tiny window near her bed, she watched lightning illuminate the mountains in brief, brilliant flashes. She thought about the bear cub in her father's drawing, somewhere out there in this same storm. Perhaps sheltering with its mother in a cave, not unlike those she'd explored with her father. She fell asleep to the rhythm of rain on the roof and her parents' hushed voices below. The sound that woke her wasn't thunder. Sarah's eyes snapped open to darkness, her heart instantly racing. She'd grown up in the wilderness long enough to differentiate between natural and human-made sounds. This was neither animal nor storm. It was the distinctive creak of weight on the cabin's front porch. Her father had specifically placed loose boards there as an early warning system. A quick glance at the small clock beside her bed showed it was just past midnight. "Thomas!" Her mother's urgent whisper carried up to the loft. "Someone's outside." Sarah crept to the edge of the loft, peering down through the slats. Her father was already on his feet, rifle in hand, motioning for her mother to extinguish. The dying embers in the fireplace, the cabin plunged into complete darkness. "Get Sarah," he whispered to Elizabeth. "Use the cellar tunnel, just like we practiced." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cellar tunnel was a narrow passage her father had dug beneath the cabin floor, emerging in the dense brush 20 yards behind the house. He'd called it a precaution, a way to escape if forest fires ever trapped them. Now she understood its true purpose. Before Elizabeth could reach the ladder, a voice called from outside, deceptively friendly, almost conversational despite the howling storm. "Miller, just need a word with you about those drawings you've been making. No need for this to get unfriendly." Thomas positioned himself beside the window, carefully peering through a crack in the shutters. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice unnaturally calm, "get Sarah now." Sarah didn't wait. She scrambled down the ladder, her nightgown tangling around her legs. Her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the trap door hidden beneath the large bearskin rug in the corner. But before they could reach it, the front door splintered inward, the crack of gunfire deafening in the small cabin. Thomas fired back, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating faces in the doorway, twisted with rage and something worse. Sarah caught glimpses of wild beards, rain-soaked hats, eyes reflecting nothing but cruelty. Her father had once pointed out a rabid wolf to her, explaining how the disease drove out everything but hunger and violence. These men had the same empty gaze. "Run!" Thomas shouted, positioning himself between the intruders and his family. "Elizabeth, take her and run!" Elizabeth dragged the rug aside and wrenched open the trapdoor. "Down!" she commanded, pushing Sarah toward the dark opening. "Follow the tunnel. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Mama, I'm right behind you," Elizabeth promised, though something in her voice made Sarah's blood run cold. "Go!" Sarah descended into the earth, the smell of damp soil enveloping her. The tunnel was narrow. Her father had built it for quick escape, not comfort. Behind her, the sounds of struggle intensified. More gunshots, the crash of furniture. Her father's shout cut suddenly short. "There's a kid!" One of the men's voices, followed by heavy footsteps crossing the cabin floor. Sarah froze, halfway down the tunnel, waiting for her mother. Instead, Elizabeth's face appeared at the opening, illuminated by a terrible orange glow that could only mean one thing. They'd set fire to the cabin. "Sarah," her mother's voice trembled with urgency and love, "head for the high country. Your father's friend, John Hammond, has a mining claim near Blacktail Peak." She thrust a small package wrapped in oilcloth through the opening. "Your father's journal. Get it to Hammond." Her eyes, so like Sarah's own, filled with tears. "Remember everything we taught you. Trust your instincts." "Mama, please." Sarah reached up, but Elizabeth was already pulling away. "I love you more than life," her mother whispered. Then she slammed the trapdoor shut. Sarah heard the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the door. Her mother was barricading it from above, ensuring no one could follow. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her mother wasn't coming. "No!" Sarah screamed, pounding against the earthen ceiling, but her voice was lost in the chaos above. More gunshots, the roar of flames, and worst of all, her mother's scream, suddenly silenced. Smoke began seeping through the cracks in the trapdoor. Sarah's survival instinct finally overrode her desperation. She turned and crawled forward, the tunnel barely wide enough for her small frame. Roots scraped her face. Dirt clung to her tear-streaked cheeks, but she kept moving, the package clutched tightly against her chest. The tunnel seemed endless, each foot forward a betrayal of the parents she was leaving behind. When she finally emerged into the rain-soaked night, the sight that greeted her stole what little breath remained in her lungs. The cabin was fully engulfed, flames reaching skyward despite the downpour, orange light dancing hideously across the clearing. Dark silhouettes moved around the inferno, men searching, weapons gleaming in the firelight. Sarah didn't allow herself to stare. She slipped into the underbrush, using every skill her father had taught her about moving silently through the forest. The rain plastered her nightgown to her skin, but also masked her sounds and washed away any scent the men might track. She clutched her father's hunting knife, the only weapon she'd had the presence of mind to grab from its place beside her bed, and headed toward the densest part of the forest. "Spread out!" a voice commanded behind her. "Find the kid! Nobody walks away from this!" Fear propelled Sarah forward, deeper into wilderness that would have terrified most children. But Sarah had spent months exploring these mountains with her father. She knew which berries were safe to eat, which trees offered the best shelter, how to find north without a compass. Knowledge that had once been adventure now became the thin line between life and death. She ran until her bare feet were torn, and bleeding until her lungs burned with each desperate breath. The first hints of dawn found her miles from the smoldering remains of her home, crouched beneath a fallen log as rain continued to pour from a leaden sky. Only then did she allow herself to examine the package her mother had thrust into her. A hands. The oilcloth had protected the contents from the rain. Inside was her father's journal, not his official field notes, but his personal documentation of what he'd discovered. Pages of detailed drawings, maps marked with poaching sites, and a list of names. Men involved in the illegal hunting operation, with one name circled repeatedly, Maxwell Crawford, with the notation, "Denver businessman, finances the whole operation." Also in the package were a small compass, a flint striker, and a folded note in her mother's handwriting. "Trust John Hammond. He'll know what to do with your father's evidence. We love you beyond measure. Be brave, our Sarah." The reality of her situation crashed over her like a physical wave. Her parents were gone. Men were hunting her. She was alone in the wilderness with nothing but a knife, her father's journal, and the knowledge he'd imparted through years of excursions into these same mountains. Sarah allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of tears, counting each second as they passed before wiping her face with muddy hands. Grief would have to wait. Survival came first. She needed shelter, food, and a plan to reach Blacktail Peak, which she knew lay some 20 miles north through the most rugged terrain. In the territory, the rain finally began to ease as Sarah took stock of her situation. Her nightgown provided almost no protection against the elements, and her feet were already cut and bruised from running barefoot through the forest. The October air held the bite of approaching winter, especially at this elevation. Without proper clothing, exposure would kill her before hunger ever had the chance. She needed to find shelter first. Pushing herself to her feet, Sarah oriented herself using the compass and began moving north, searching for anything that might offer protection from the elements. The terrain grew increasingly steep and rocky as she progressed. The familiar, mixed forest giving way to denser pine and spruce. By midday, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. She hadn't slept since being awakened by the attack, hadn't eaten since dinner the previous evening, and shock had drained what little energy remained. When she stumbled upon the small cave entrance, nearly hidden by a fallen tree and thick undergrowth, it seemed almost too perfect. Her father had taught her to check any potential shelter carefully. Caves in these mountains often house predators seeking the same refuge humans might desire. Sarah approached cautiously, knife clutched in her trembling hand, straining to hear any sounds from within. The cave mouth was narrow, just wide enough for her to slip through if she turned sideways. Inside, it opened to a space perhaps 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, the ceiling low enough that an adult would need to crouch, perfect for a temporary refuge. More importantly, it was dry, the floor covered with a layer of sand and small stones rather than damp earth. Sarah gathered armfuls of pine boughs from nearby trees, creating a crude mattress in the deepest corner of the cave. The physical labor helped distract her from the images that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. Her father falling, her mother's final words, flames consuming the only home she'd known in these mountains. Work was sanctuary. Work meant survival. Next came fire. The flint striker was a blessing, but she needed dry tinder. She searched the cave thoroughly, finding enough small twigs and pine needles that had blown in and remained protected from the rain. Her father had drilled her repeatedly on fire starting, insisting it was the most critical wilderness skill. Fire means life, he told her. It provides warmth, protection, the ability to purify water and cook food. Master fire. And you've mastered half of what you need to survive. It took 7 attempts before the spark caught, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly gave up. But finally, a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Sarah fed it carefully, adding progressively larger sticks until she had a small but steady fire. The smoke mostly drifted out through the cave entrance, though some lingered near the low ceiling. She would need to keep it small to avoid suffocation, but it was enough to ward off the deepening chill. Only then did she allow herself to truly feel the magnitude of her hunger and thirst. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, late afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees. Sarah ventured out, staying within sight of her cave as she searched for anything edible. She found a small patch of late blackberries, the fruits mostly past their prime, but still providing much-needed nourishment. A small stream trickled nearby, offering clean mountain water that she drank until her stomach ached. Returning to her shelter, Sarah arranged her meager possessions: the knife, the compass, her father's journal, and a handful of remaining berries. The reality of her situation settled over her like a physical weight. She was miles from the nearest settlement, being hunted by killers with nothing but her wits and her father's teachings to keep her alive. John Hammond's mining claim was at least 3 more days of travel through increasingly difficult terrain, assuming she could maintain her northward course without getting lost. As darkness fell, Sarah huddled beside her small fire, the dancing flames, both comfort and painful reminder of the inferno that had consumed her home. She wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking slightly as exhaustion and grief threatened to consume her. The distant howl of a wolf pack echoed through the mountains, reminding her that hunger wasn't the only danger stalking these woods. "Be brave," she whispered, repeating her mother's final written words. "Be brave." Sleep came in fitful bursts, each sound from the forest snapping her back to terrified wakefulness. When dawn finally broke, Sarah emerged from the cave stiff and disoriented. She had survived her first night alone in the wilderness, but many more lay ahead. She needed better clothing, more substantial food, and a walking stick to help navigate the rough terrain. After drinking from the stream and gathering more berries, Sarah set about addressing her most immediate needs. She used her knife to cut lengths of pine bough, weaving them into crude but effective foot coverings. Not quite shoes, but enough to protect her soles from further damage. From a deadfall near the stream, she selected a sturdy branch of appropriate height, using her knife to strip away smaller offshoots until she had a functional walking staff. Clothing presented a greater challenge. Her nightgown, though torn and dirty, was the only garment she possessed. Sarah examined it critically, then made a difficult decision. Using her knife, she cut away the bottom portion just above her knees, creating a shorter garment that would allow easier movement through the underbrush. The removed fabric she fashioned into a crude sling bag to carry her possessions, tying it across her body. Before departing her temporary shelter, Sarah carefully studied her father's journal once more, particularly the rough map he had drawn of the region. If she followed the stream northward, it would eventually join a larger river that flowed past the base of Blacktail Peak. Following waterways meant she would have a constant source of drinking water and potential food, as her father had taught her the basics of hand fishing in shallow pools. With her few preparations complete, Sarah extinguished her fire and stepped out into the morning sunlight, The mountains stretched before her, vast and indifferent to her plight. Somewhere in those towering peaks was John Hammond, the only adult left in the world she could trust. Somewhere, too, were the men who had murdered her parents, perhaps still searching for the witness who had escaped. Sarah took a deep breath, gripped her walking staff, and began following the stream northward. Each step carried her further from everything familiar, deeper into wilderness few settlers ever ventured. The weight of her father's journal pressed against her side, a constant reminder of what she had lost and why she had to survive. She had covered perhaps 2 miles when the stream opened into a wider pool, the water clear enough to reveal darting shapes of small trout. Her stomach cramped with hunger, the berries she'd gathered providing minimal sustenance. Sarah recalled her father's lessons on improvised fishing, how to create a still pool by placing rocks in specific formations, how to move slowly and strike with blinding speed. For nearly an hour, she stood motionless in the shallow edge of the pool, her makeshift spear poised over the water. 3 times she struck, and 3 times the fish darted away before her reflexes could connect. Frustration and hunger made her movements increasingly desperate, driving the fish further from reach. "Patience," she whispered, hearing her father's voice in the word. "Hunting isn't about speed, it's about stillness." She forced herself to breathe slowly, to become part of the stream rather than an intruder upon it. When the next trout drifted into range, Sarah's strike was fluid and precise. The makeshift spear pierced the fish, pinning it momentarily to the stream bed before she scooped it onto the bank. It was small, barely enough for a meal, but it represented something beyond mere food. It was proof that she could provide for herself, that her father's lessons had taken root. Sarah cleaned the fish with practiced movements, her knife separating flesh from bone, as she'd done dozens of times when helping prepare family meals. The rawness of the meat turned her stomach, but she knew the danger of lighting a fire in daylight when men might be searching for her. Instead, she forced herself to eat the fish uncooked, remembering her father's stories of native peoples who consumed certain fish this way when necessary. Each bite was an act of will, but the protein revitalized her in ways the berries could not. With her immediate hunger addressed, Sarah continued northward, following the ever-widening stream through increasingly rugged terrain. The afternoon brought darker clouds and a sharp wind that cut through her inadequate clothing. She estimated she'd covered nearly 6 miles, a remarkable distance given her condition, but still far short of safety. As the day waned, Sarah began searching for another shelter. Unlike the previous night's good fortune, this section of forest offered few natural caves or overhangs. Eventually, she settled for a dense thicket of pine, the interlaced branches creating a natural windbreak. Using her knife and what daylight remained, she cut additional boughs to create a crude lean-to, piling needles beneath for insulation from the cold ground. That night brought rain again, seeping through her makeshift shelter despite her best efforts. Sarah curled into a tight ball, preserving what body heat she could, clutching the journal to her chest as if it contained not just evidence but something of her parents' essence. Sleep came in brief, tormented intervals, her dreams filled with flames and pursuing shadows. Dawn of the 3rd day found Sarah feverish and disoriented, her body rebelling against exposure and inadequate nutrition. Her feet, despite the pine bough coverings, were blistered and possibly infected. Each step sent shards of pain up her legs, but stopping meant death, from exposure if not from the men who might still be tracking her. "One foot in front of the other," she told herself, using her walking staff more as a crutch now than an aid. "Just keep moving north." The stream had merged with others, becoming a proper creek that tumbled between rocky banks. Sarah followed. It mechanically, her mind increasingly detached from her suffering body. At times, she imagined her parents walking beside her, offering encouragement when her steps faltered. Whether hallucination or spiritual comfort, she accepted their presence gratefully. By midday, the terrain changed dramatically. The forest thinned as the creek carved its way through a section of sheer rock walls, a small canyon that funneled winds into bitter, cutting gusts. Sarah had no choice but to wade through the freezing water in sections where the banks disappeared entirely, the cold seeping into her bones until her limbs moved with wooden stiffness. The canyon eventually opened to a wider valley, the creek, joining a proper river that roared with early snowmelt from higher elevations. On the far horizon, barely visible through gathering clouds, stood a jagged peak that matched her father's description of Blacktail Mountain. She had managed to stay on course, but the river presented a new obstacle, too deep and swift to cross safely, particularly in her weakened state. Following the riverbank, Sarah searched for any sign of human habitation. Smoke from a chimney, cleared land, the distant shape of a cabin. Instead, the valley stretched empty and wild, the river curving away to the east while her destination lay due north. She would have to leave the water's course, striking out across more exposed terrain without its guidance. The decision came with another realization. The valley offered little shelter for the coming night, with fewer trees and more open ground. The temperature was dropping rapidly as a new storm system approached from the west. Without adequate protection, this night might well be her last. It was then that Sarah spotted it, a dark opening in the rocky hillside across the river, larger than the small cave she'd sheltered in previously. The challenge was crossing the swift-flowing water that separated her from potential sanctuary. She studied the river carefully, searching for any narrowing or shallow section that might offer safer passage. A quarter-mile downstream, the river split around a small island of accumulated stone and debris, a natural ford that reduced the water's power and depth. Sarah made her way carefully along the bank, her strength fading with each step. When she reached the crossing point, she tested the water's depth with her walking staff, finding it came just above her knees at the deepest point. With no choice but to proceed, Sarah stepped into the frigid current, gasping as the cold water stole what little warmth remained in her body. The river pulled at her, threatening to sweep her smaller frame downstream, but she fought against the current, planting her staff firmly with each precarious step. Halfway across, disaster struck. Her foot slipped on moss-covered stone, sending her crashing into the water. The current immediately seized her, pulling her downstream as she frantically clutched her walking staff. The sling containing the journal slipped from her shoulder, nearly lost to the river before she managed to grasp it with numbing fingers. Pure survival instinct kept her head above water as she was carried downstream, her body colliding painfully with submerged rocks. When the river curved sharply, centrifugal force pushed her toward the outer bank, where overhanging roots provided a desperate handhold. With the last of her strength, Sarah pulled herself from the water, collapsing on the rocky shore, soaked and shivering uncontrollably. Hypothermia would claim her within hours if she didn't find shelter and warmth. The cave she'd spotted earlier now lay somewhere above her on the hillside. With trembling limbs, Sarah forced herself upright, clutching the water-damaged journal to her chest. She had come too far, endured too much, to surrender now. The climb was agonizing, her waterlogged clothing dragging at her like lead weights. Twice she slipped, reopening cuts on her hands and knees. But something beyond mere survival drove her forward. A promise to her parents, a determination that their deaths would not be in vain, that their killer would face justice through the evidence she carried. When she finally reached the cave entrance, Sarah nearly wept with relief. Unlike her previous shelter, this cave extended deep into the hillside, the entrance large enough to accommodate a full-grown adult. Using her walking staff for support, she ventured cautiously inside, alert for any signs of animal occupation, despite her desperate need for shelter. The cave floor sloped gently upward, staying remarkably dry despite its proximity to the river. Sarah proceeded deeper, finding the interior expanded into a chamber perhaps 20 feet across. Enough ambient light filtered from the entrance to reveal something unexpected: the remnants of an old campfire, long cold, but evidence that others had used this shelter before her. Sarah ventured deeper into the cave, her fingers tracing the soot-stained wall where previous fires had burned. The discovery of human presence before her was both comforting and concerning. Had trappers used this place? Or perhaps the very poachers who had destroyed her family? The cave narrowed briefly before opening into a second chamber, where the ceiling rose high enough that she couldn't see it in the dim light. A strange, musky odor filled this inner sanctuary, different from the damp stone smell of the outer cave. Sarah paused, her instincts suddenly alert. She was not alone. A soft, whimpering sound came from the darkest corner of the chamber. Sarah froze, her hand tightening around her knife. The sound came again, not threatening, but plaintive. Almost childlike in its distress. She strained to see through the shadows, wishing desperately for a torch. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she made out a shape on the ground, larger than a dog, but smaller than a full-grown deer. The creature shifted, and Sarah caught a glimpse of thick fur and rounded ears. A bear cub. Her heart leaped into her throat. Where there was a cub, a mother bear would surely be nearby. Sarah began to back away slowly, knowing that nothing in these mountains was more dangerous than a female bear protecting her young. But as she retreated, her foot dislodged a small stone that clattered across the cave floor. The cub's head jerked up, its eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the chamber. Instead of drawing a protective mother bear, the noise seemed to frighten the cub itself. It scrambled backward, pressing itself against the cave wall, making that same whimpering sound. Sarah hesitated, confusion replacing fear. A bear cub this young should not be alone, especially as winter approached. She took a tentative step. Forward, then another. The cub cowered but didn't flee deeper into the cave. 10 feet away, Sarah stopped. From this distance, she could see the cub more clearly. A young male, perhaps 6 months old, with cinnamon-brown fur. His coat was healthy, but he appeared thin, ribs visible beneath his fur. Most concerning was the absence of a mother bear. Sarah scanned the chamber carefully, looking for any sign of an adult grizzly. Instead, her eyes fell on a darker patch on the ground near the entrance to a third chamber. Instinct told her what it was before her mind could fully process the sight. Blood, a lot of it, dried to a rusty brown on the stone floor. With growing dread, Sarah edged toward the next chamber, knife held before her. The smell hit her first, the unmistakable scent of death. Just inside lay the massive form of a female grizzly, her body stiff with rigor mortis, a bullet hole clearly visible in her skull. Sarah's stomach heaved, but she forced down the bile rising in her throat. The poachers had been here, perhaps, just days ago. They'd shot the mother bear within her den, and for some reason left without taking the cub. Maybe they'd been interrupted, or perhaps they only wanted the adult's pelt and claws. Whatever the reason, they'd orphaned this cub, just as surely as they'd orphaned Sarah herself. She returned to the main chamber where the cub remained pressed against the wall, trembling. Looking at him, Sarah felt a strange kinship bloom within her chest. They were both alone in a world suddenly turned hostile, both survivors of the same men's cruelty, both orphans with winter approaching and slim chances of survival on their own. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, knowing the words meant nothing to the frightened animal, but needing to say them anyway. "I'm alone too." The immediate problem was warmth and food. Sarah still shivered violently from her dunking in the river, her clothes soaked through and her body temperature dangerously low. She needed fire, desperately. The old campfire site in the outer chamber offered charred remains of previous fires, saving her the trouble of gathering new tinder from outside. Using her flint striker, Sarah managed to ignite the driest remnants, nursing the spark into a small flame that she fed with pieces of broken branches left by previous occupants. As the fire grew, blessed warmth began to spread through the outer chamber. Sarah stripped off her wet nightgown, wringing it out before spreading it on nearby rocks to dry. Clad only in her undergarments, she huddled as close to the flames as she dared, rubbing her arms and legs to restore circulation. Her father's journal had suffered in the river crossing, but the oilcloth wrapping had protected the pages from complete ruin. She laid it open near the fire, hoping to dry it before the ink blurred beyond recognition. The cub remained in the inner chamber, but Sarah occasionally caught glimpses of his small face peering around the passage connecting the rooms. Curiosity was overcoming fear, at least momentarily. As feeling returned to her extremities in painful tingles, Sarah took stock of her situation. Night was falling outside, and she had no food. Her clothes would take hours to dry, and even then, the thin cotton nightgown offered minimal protection against the mountain cold. She needed more substantial garments, more reliable shelter, and a source of food to sustain her through the journey to Hammond's mining claim. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now inhabited a bear's den, seeking warmth from the same fire site that may have been used by the hunters who'd killed its occupant. Life in these mountains existed in such brutal circles. Her father had often spoken of the balance of nature, but there was nothing balanced about men who killed for profit rather than necessity. When her shivering finally subsided, Sarah wrapped herself in her still damp nightgown and ventured back to the inner chamber. The bear cub had retreated to his corner, but watched her with alert, frightened eyes. Near his paws lay the gnawed remains of what might have been a rabbit, his last meal, perhaps provided by his mother before she was killed. "You need food too," Sarah said softly. "Maybe we can help each other." The idea forming in her mind was either brilliance born of desperation or utter madness. Her father had told stories of mountain men who'd raised wolf pups, of native children who formed bonds with wild creatures. But a bear, even a cub, possessed strength that could easily overpower a child Sarah's age. Yet something about the young bear's frightened eyes reflected her own situation so perfectly that she couldn't bring herself to abandon him. For tonight at least, they would share the cave. Sarah retreated to the outer chamber, feeding her small fire with the remaining wood. Tomorrow would bring hard decisions about her path forward. For now, survival through the night was victory enough. Sleep came in fitful bursts, her body's exhaustion battling with the pain of her injuries and the persistent chill that seemed embedded in her bones. Each time she woke, Sarah added more wood to the fire, grateful for the stockpile left by previous occupants. During one such awakening near dawn, she sensed rather than heard movement nearby. Opening her eyes, she found herself staring directly at the bear cub, who had crept into the outer chamber and now sat just beyond the fire's immediate circle of light. They regarded each other in silence, predator and prey by nature's design, yet linked by circumstance into something undefined. The cub's nose twitched, sampling her scent on the air. Sarah remained perfectly still, remembering her father's lessons about encounters with wild animals. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact for too long, no threatening postures. "I'll call you Scout," she whispered, the name coming unbidden to her lips. Her father had once had a hunting dog by that name, loyal, intelligent, always alert to danger. The cub tilted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, but showed no aggression. After a long moment, he retreated back to the inner chamber, apparently having satisfied his curiosity about the strange human sharing his shelter. As dawn's grey light filtered into the cave entrance, Sarah faced her first full day as a wilderness orphan. Her nightgown had dried overnight, but remained woefully inadequate for the harsh mountain climate. Her first priority was finding more, substantial clothing. The second was food. The leftover fish from yesterday's catch had spoiled, leaving her with nothing to eat since the previous afternoon. Outside, the world was transformed by a light dusting of snow that had fallen during the night, the first of the season, and a sobering reminder that winter approached rapidly. Sarah's breath formed clouds in the chill air as she scanned her surroundings. From this elevation, she could see the river cutting through the valley below, and, in the far distance, the jagged outline of Blacktail Peak. Her father's friend was somewhere near that mountain, her only hope for safety and justice. The immediate area around the cave entrance showed signs of game trails, narrow paths worn by animals traveling to and from the river. Sarah's stomach growled painfully as she considered her options for hunting. The knife was her only weapon, useless for bringing down anything larger than a squirrel. She needed to craft more effective tools or set traps if she hoped to catch substantial food. Her father had taught her the basics of snare construction using flexible saplings and cord. Without proper cordage, Sarah improvised by cutting strips from the bottom of her nightgown, braiding them into stronger strands. Within an hour, she had constructed 2 simple snares, which she placed along the most promising sections of the game trails. While waiting for the traps to potentially yield results, Sarah explored the immediate area surrounding the cave, staying within sight of its entrance. Near the river's edge, she discovered a patch of late-season watercress, which she gathered eagerly. The peppery greens would provide few calories, but contained precious vitamins that might ward off the scurvy her father had warned could afflict those who ate only meat for too long. A stand of pine trees yielded another treasure, inner bark. That, while bitter and resinous, could be chewed for sustenance in dire circumstances. Sarah harvested a small amount, careful not to damage the trees unnecessarily. Her father had taught her that wilderness survival wasn't about conquering nature, but cooperating with it, taking only what was needed and ensuring the source remained viable for future use. By midday, Sarah returned to check her snares. The first was undisturbed, but the second held a small snowshoe hare, its white winter coat already beginning to replace the brown of summer. Sarah felt a momentary pang as she approached the struggling animal, but hunger quickly overcame sentiment. With a whispered apology, she dispatched the hare with her knife, using the skills her father had demonstrated during their hunting trips. The hare would provide meat for at least 2 meals. Sarah cleaned the animal by the river, saving everything useful. The pelt, though small, might serve as mittens or foot coverings. The sinew could replace her makeshift cordage for future snares. Even the bones could become tools with proper preparation. She carried her prize back toward the cave, proud of her successful hunt, yet uncomfortably aware of how much she still lacked for long-term survival. As she approached the cave entrance, movement caught her eye. The bear cub, Scout, stood just outside, his nose working furiously as he caught the scent of fresh meat. Sarah froze, suddenly aware of the potential danger. Even a young bear possessed strength and instincts that made him unpredictable. Yet, Scout made no aggressive move toward her. Instead, he watched with obvious hunger, a soft whining sound escaping his throat. An idea formed in Sarah's mind, dangerous, perhaps foolish, but potentially beneficial to them both. Moving slowly, she cut a small portion of meat from the hare and tossed it towards Scout, landing it several feet away from him. The cub flinched at her movement, but didn't retreat. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the offering, sniffed it thoroughly, then devoured it in 2 quick bites. He immediately looked up at Sarah, his eyes now fixed on the remaining meat in her hands. "That's all for now," she told him, backing toward the cave entrance. "The rest I need to cook." Scout followed at a cautious distance, his hunger apparently overcoming his fear. Inside the cave, Sarah rekindled her fire and fashioned a crude spit from green branches. As the hare began to cook, filling the cave with tantalizing aromas. Scout settled just inside the entrance, watching the process with obvious interest. "You've probably never seen cooked meat before," Sarah said, finding comfort in speaking aloud, even if her audience couldn't understand. "Your mother would have taught you to hunt by now if those men hadn't come." The mention of Scout's mother brought her own loss rushing back, a wave of grief, so powerful it momentarily stole her breath. She'd been operating on instinct since fleeing the burning cabin, focused entirely on immediate survival. Now, with a moment's respite and the fire's warmth seeping into her bones, the full reality of her situation crashed over her. Her parents were gone, her home destroyed. She was alone in the wilderness, with winter approaching and killers, potentially, still searching for her. Tears came suddenly and violently, sobs racking her small frame as she curled forward, arms wrapped around her knees. She cried for her mother's gentle hands, her father's patient teachings, the life that had been ripped away from her in a single night of violence. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen, until the fire burned low and the hair began to smoke from neglect. The smell of scorching meat finally roused her from grief's grip. Sarah wiped her face with grimy hands and adjusted the cooking spit, salvaging what she could of the meal. When the hare was fully cooked, she divided it, placing a portion near the cave entrance for Scout while taking the rest for herself. The cub approached his share warily, sniffing extensively before tasting. His initial uncertainty quickly gave way to enthusiastic consumption, the meat disappearing in moments. Sarah ate more slowly, savoring the desperately needed protein. The meat was overcooked in spots and nearly raw in others, but it was the most satisfying meal she'd ever tasted. As she ate, she contemplated her next steps. The journey to Blacktail Peak would take at least 2 more days, possibly longer, given her condition and the deteriorating weather. She needed better clothing, more reliable weapons, and a clearer sense of direction than the distant silhouette of a mountain peak. Most pressing was the question of Scout. She couldn't take a bear cub with her. The very idea was absurd, yet leaving him meant certain death for the young animal. Without his mother's guidance through his first winter, he would likely starve or fall prey to larger predators. The rational choice was clear: continue to Blacktail Peak alone as quickly as possible. Yet when Scout finished his portion of meat and looked toward her with those intelligent eyes, Sarah found herself unable to commit to abandoning him. "One more night," she told herself. "I'll rest, gather strength, and leave at first light." The remainder of the day passed in practical activities, setting more snares, gathering additional firewood, and exploring the cave system more thoroughly. Behind the chamber containing the mother bear's body, Sarah discovered a narrow passage leading to a small, natural chimney that vented to the open air above. This explained why the fire smoke dissipated rather than filling the cave, making it a far more viable long-term shelter than she'd initially realized. The dead grizzly presented both opportunity and challenge. Her thick winter pelt would make invaluable clothing, but Sarah lacked the tools and strength to properly skin such a large animal. Instead, she harvested small sections of fur from the legs, using her knife to create crude but effective mittens and additional covering for her feet. The work was gruesome, but necessity overcame squeamishness. By evening, she had fashioned basic protection for her extremities, vital additions as the temperature continued to drop outside. That night, Scout ventured closer to the fire than before, eventually settling just a few feet from where Sarah huddled for warmth. She studied him in the flickering light, noting how his movements mimicked those of the adult bears she'd observed with her father. Already he showed the distinctive hump of muscle developing at his shoulders, the massive paws that would someday carry powerful claws. Yet there was still something puppy-like in his proportions, his head too large for his body, his movements sometimes clumsy and uncoordinated. "You're caught between, just like me," Sarah murmured, Not a baby anymore, but not grown either. Scout's ears twitched at her voice, but his eyes remained fixed on the flames. Bears possessed an innate fear of fire, her father had explained. Yet this cub seemed to recognize its value in the deepening cold. Adaptation in the face of necessity, another trait they shared. Morning brought fresh snow and a difficult decision. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with heavy clouds promising more precipitation throughout the day. Travel would be treacherous, but delay meant diminishing chances of reaching Blacktail Peak before winter fully claimed the mountains. Sarah prepared herself mentally for departure, packing her few possessions and checking that her father's journal was secure. As she kindled the fire one last time, intending to cook the remains of yesterday's hare for a final meal before departing, Scout entered from the inner chamber. He approached closer than ever before, sniffing audibly at her fur-lined mittens. Sarah remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the bear cub investigated her scent. After a thorough examination, Scout did something unexpected. He flopped down beside the fire, not quite touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his small body. "I have to leave," Sarah told him, her voice catching. "I can't stay here." Scout gazed at her impassively, as if questioning the necessity of her departure. Outside, the snow began falling more heavily, thick flakes visible through the cave entrance. Sarah's resolve wavered. Setting out in a snowstorm was foolhardy at best, potentially fatal at worst. Perhaps one more day of rest and preparation would be wiser than immediate departure. Just until the storm passes, she decided aloud. One day became two as the storm intensified into a full blizzard, howling winds driving snow into drifts that would make travel impossible. During this confinement, the relationship between girl and bear cub evolved in subtle ways. Scout began accepting food directly from Sarah's hand, their fingers occasionally brushing fur in these exchanges. He followed her movements throughout the cave with alert interest rather than fearful vigilance. At night, they slept near the same fire, though still maintaining a respectful distance. Sarah found herself talking to Scout constantly, narrating her activities and sharing fragmented memories of her life before. The one-sided conversations preserved her tenuous grip on humanity and language. In turn, she began interpreting Scout's vocalizations and body language, learning to distinguish between his hunger whines and his warnings when unfamiliar sounds echoed from outside. On the third morning, Sarah awoke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed beneath a pristine blanket of snow nearly 2 feet deep. Sunlight sparkled across the unmarked expanse, so bright it hurt her eyes after days in the cave's dim interior. The beauty momentarily distracted her from the implications. Travel would be extremely difficult through such deep snow, especially without proper clothing or snowshoes. Sarah knelt at the cave entrance, scooping a handful of snow to quench her thirst. Behind her, Scout lumbered forward to investigate the changed landscape, his nose working overtime to process the clean, sharp scents. He ventured a few feet onto the snow, his weight causing him to sink nearly to his belly. After several clumsy attempts to navigate the deep powder, he retreated to the cave entrance, shaking his paws in evident displeasure. "Not so easy, is it?" Sarah observed, finding unexpected amusement in his reaction. The delay had served one unexpected purpose. It had given her time to create more substantial tools. Using the sinew from the hair and green branches, she had fashioned a crude bow. Without proper arrows, its usefulness was limited, but it represented progress toward more effective hunting. She had also woven additional strips of nightgown material into a small net that might serve for catching fish in shallower portions of the river, should she find any not frozen over. Most importantly, the extended stay had allowed her body to recover somewhat from its ordeal. The fever had broken, The worst of her cuts had begun healing, and regular meals of hare meat, supplemented by additional successful snares during the storm, had restored some of her strength. She was still woefully underprepared for the journey ahead, but her chances of survival had improved marginally. What hadn't changed was the presence of Scout. The expected separation had been postponed by circumstance, creating a bond that grew more complicated with each passing day. Sarah still recognized the impossibility of traveling with a bear cub, yet the thought of abandoning him now caused an almost physical pain. They had become unlikely companions in survival, each filling some portion of the void left by their lost families. As midday approached with its slightly warmer temperatures, Sarah decided to at least explore the immediate area beyond the cave, assessing conditions for potential travel the following day. She donned her fur-augmented footwear and mittens, wrapped her nightgown more tightly around her thin frame, and stepped into the snow-transformed world. The depth made walking exhausting, each step requiring her to lift her legs high and push through the resistance of packed snow. Scout followed, seemingly equally determined to accompany her despite his own difficulties with the conditions. Together, they forged a meandering path down toward the river, which ran swift and dark between snow-covered banks. The effort left Sarah breathless, her muscles burning from exertion. Scout fared somewhat better with his wider paws, providing more surface area, but even he struggled in deeper sections. By the time they reached the river's edge, both were ready for rest. Sarah cleared snow from a fallen log and sat heavily, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold air. Scout collapsed nearby, his tongue lolling as he panted from the exercise. "We make quite a pair," Sarah observed between deep breaths. "Neither of us really built for these conditions." The thought triggered a memory from one of her father's lessons, how different animals adapted to winter in different ways. Bears typically denned up, living off fat reserves accumulated during summer and fall. Humans created shelter, clothing, and continued to hunt or rely on stored provisions. Both strategies required preparation that neither she nor Scout had completed. Before winter's arrival, a sound from upriver caught their attention simultaneously, the distinct crack of breaking ice followed by voices. Human voices. Sarah froze, instinctively ducking lower behind the fallen log. Scout's reaction was more pronounced, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he oriented toward the potential threat. "Shh," Sarah whispered, placing a cautious hand on Scout's back. To her surprise, he quieted immediately, though his muscles remained tense beneath her fingers. Through gaps in the riverside vegetation, Sarah could make out two figures moving along the opposite bank, perhaps 100 yards upstream. Men with rifles, making their way carefully across the snow-covered terrain. Even at this distance, the sight of weapons sent fear coursing through her body. Were these the same men who had attacked her family? Poachers seeking more trophies? Or perhaps legitimate hunters who might offer help? The men's voices carried across the water, fragments of conversation becoming audible as they paused to rest. "Worth coming back for," one said, gesturing toward the hillside where Sarah's cave was located. "Big female grizzly, perfect winter. Pelt. Crawford said to leave the cub," the other replied. "Not worth the trouble for such a small hide." "Could have at least shot it," the first man grumbled. "Letting it starve is wasteful." "We got interrupted," his companion reminded him. "Those prospectors nearly caught us that day. Besides, the cub's surely dead by now in this weather." Sarah's blood ran cold. These were the men who had killed Scout's mother, the same type who had murdered her parents. Her hand tightened instinctively on Scout's fur, feeling his growl before she heard it. She pressed more firmly, silently willing him to remain quiet. Discovery now would mean death for them both. The men continued their journey downriver, apparently heading toward some predetermined destination. Only when they had disappeared around a bend did Sarah release her breath, her heart still hammering against her ribs. Scout remained tense beside her, his eyes fixed on the point where the men had vanished. "We need to go," Sarah whispered. "They might come back, or others like them." The encounter solidified her determination to reach Blacktail Peak and John Hammond as quickly as possible. These men had mentioned Crawford, the same name her father had circled repeatedly in his journal. The connection confirmed her suspicions that the same organization responsible for the poaching was behind her parents' murder. Her father's documentation was even more valuable than she'd realized. It linked specific individuals to both wildlife crimes and potential homicide. The journey back to the cave was slower, both Sarah and Scout maintaining vigilant watch for any sign of the hunters returning. Inside their shelter, Sarah moved with renewed purpose, gathering her few possessions and preparing for immediate departure, despite the challenging conditions. The conversation she'd overheard suggested other men might visit the cave site specifically to retrieve the dead grizzly's pelt. Remaining meant risking an encounter she couldn't survive. As she worked, a new realization formed. Scout would have to come with her. Leaving him behind meant abandoning him to either starvation or discovery by the returning poachers. The idea of traveling with a bear cub remained absurd, yet somehow less absurd than the alternatives. They had survived together this long. Perhaps they could continue to do so, at least until she reached Hammond and civilization. "We're leaving at first light," she told Scout, who watched her preparations with curious eyes. "Both of us." The decision made, Sarah focused on final preparations. She cooked the last of her meat, knowing the protein would be essential for the journey ahead. She fashioned a crude sling to carry her father's journal and the few tools she'd accumulated. Most importantly, she spent hours creating rudimentary snowshoes from flexible branches and strips of bark, weaving them into rough, oval shapes that would distribute her weight more effectively across the deep snow. That night, Scout settled. Closer to the fire than ever before, his body only inches from Sarah's as they shared the warmth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and an unprecedented journey. A girl and a bear cub, traveling together through the winter wilderness, bound by shared loss and the simple determination to survive. As sleep claimed her, Sarah placed her hand gently on Scout's fur, drawing comfort from his steady breathing, and the knowledge that, despite everything, she was no longer completely alone. Dawn arrived with cruel clarity, the temperature having dropped dramatically overnight. Sarah's breath formed thick clouds as she made final preparations, shivering despite her proximity to the fire. Outside, the snow had developed a frozen crust that crackled beneath her makeshift snowshoes as she tested them on the cave threshold. They were crude but functional, distributing her weight enough to prevent her from sinking completely into the deeper drifts. Scout seemed reluctant to leave the cave's warmth, lingering by the dying fire until Sarah called to him softly. Together, they emerged into the crystalline morning, leaving behind the shelter that had sustained them through the first storm of winter. Sarah oriented herself toward the distant silhouette of Blacktail Peak, barely visible through the clear air, and took her first determined steps toward an uncertain future. The journey began slowly, each movement requiring conscious effort as Sarah adapted to walking with the awkward snowshoes. Scout followed in her tracks, finding it easier to navigate where she had already broken through the icy crust. They made an incongruous pair, a rail-thin girl in a tattered nightgown, augmented with bear fur accessories, followed by a half-grown grizzly cub who should have been denning for winter rather than trudging through deep snow. Their pace improved as the morning progressed, Sarah finding a rhythm that conserved energy while maintaining forward motion. They followed the river when possible, knowing it would eventually lead toward Blacktail Peak, according to her father's map. When bluffs or terrain forced them away from the water, Sarah used her compass to maintain their northward heading, always keeping the distinctive mountain peak in sight when the landscape allowed. By midday, hunger began gnawing at Sarah's stomach. Her snares had been left behind, and hunting in these conditions would be nearly impossible without proper weapons. She stopped periodically to dig through the snow with her mittened hands, searching for any edible vegetation that might remain accessible. Occasionally, she found dried berries still clinging to protected bushes, or pine nuts that had fallen before, being buried by snow. These meager findings she shared with Scout, though they did little to satisfy either of their appetites. The afternoon brought new challenges as clouds gathered and the temperature continued to drop. Wind began to build from the northwest, driving fine particles of snow that stung Sarah's exposed face. She pulled her nightgown up to cover her nose and mouth, leaving only her eyes exposed to the elements. Scout pressed closer as they walked, occasionally brushing against her legs as if seeking reassurance in the deteriorating conditions. As daylight began to fade, Sarah faced the worrying prospect of spending a night without adequate shelter. The cave had spoiled her with its protection from wind and predators, its natural chimney for fire smoke. Out here, exposed on the valley floor, they were vulnerable in ways that made her stomach clench with anxiety. She scanned the landscape desperately for any feature that might offer refuge, a stand of dense trees, an overhanging rock formation, even a depression in the ground that might be deepened into a snow cave. What she found instead was completely unexpected. As they rounded a bend in the river, a small structure came into view perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, unmistakably human-made, with squared corners and a peaked roof now nearly hidden under snow. Smoke rose from a metal chimney, suggesting current occupation. Sarah stopped abruptly, Scout bumping into her legs from behind. Her first instinct was to retreat immediately. Unknown humans represented potential danger, especially in this remote region where her parents' killers operated. Yet the approaching night and falling temperature presented equal danger of a different sort. Without shelter, she and Scout might not survive until morning, particularly if the building storm intensified as expected. Sarah crouched beside Scout, speaking in the low voice she'd developed for their communications. "We need to be careful," she told him, as if he could understand the complexities of their situation. "Stay here while I look closer." Leaving Scout partially concealed behind a fallen tree, Sarah crept forward through the deepening twilight, approaching the structure with extreme caution. As she drew nearer, details became clearer. A small cabin built of rough-hewn logs, a woodpile stacked along one wall, a single window glowing with lamplight. Outside stood a sturdy horse, blanketed against the cold and contentedly munching from a feed bag. Not the multiple mounts she would expect from a group of poachers or outlaws. Sarah circled slowly, staying low and using the snow-covered terrain for concealment. From a different angle, she could see that the cabin appeared to be a line shack, a simple shelter used seasonally by ranchers tending distant herds, or travelers needing refuge from mountain weather. A single set of tracks led to the door, partially filled by recent snow, but clearly made by one person arriving alone. The question remained, friend or foe? Sarah weighed her options carefully. Approaching meant risking discovery by someone potentially connected to her parents' killers. Avoiding the cabin meant another night in deteriorating weather with no food and inadequate shelter. Her decision was complicated further by Scout's presence. Even a friendly wilderness traveler might react badly to a bear cub, seeing him as either threat or prize rather than companion. As darkness closed in completely and the temperature plummeted further, Sarah made her choice. She would observe longer before deciding whether to approach. Returning to Scout, she led him toward a dense stand of pine trees within sight of the cabin, but far enough away to remain undetected. There, she cleared snow from beneath the lowest branches, creating a small, protected space where wind couldn't penetrate as easily. Using techniques her father had taught her, Sarah constructed a rudimentary shelter using fallen branches and pine boughs, creating a windbreak that trapped what little body heat she and Scout generated. It was far from ideal, but it might prevent. Freezing through the night, Scout seemed to understand the need for closeness in these dire circumstances, pressing his warm body against hers without hesitation. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, grateful beyond words for his presence and warmth. Through the trees, the cabin window glowed like a beacon in the darkness. Sarah watched it longingly, imagining the warmth and safety within. Who was inside? A trapper? A prospector? Perhaps even a ranger or lawman? The uncertainty kept her rooted in place, despite the growing discomfort of her improvised shelter. Better cold than captured, or worse. As the night deepened and temperatures dropped, further, Sarah's resolve began to waver. Her extremities grew numb, despite Scout's warmth, and hunger weakened her further. The storm intensified, snow finding its way through gaps in their shelter despite her best efforts. Fear of the unknown cabin occupant gradually gave way to fear of a more immediate danger, freezing to death in the wilderness, just days after escaping her family's killers. "We have to try," she finally whispered to Scout, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We can't stay here." Sarah emerged from their inadequate shelter, numb fingers struggling to secure her father's journal inside her clothing. Scout followed, shaking snow from his fur as they began moving toward the distant light of the cabin window. The storm had worsened considerably, visibility reduced to just a few feet ahead. Only the glowing window provided orientation in the swirling whiteness. As they approached, Sarah's anxiety mounted. How would she explain herself? A girl alone in the wilderness. What if the occupant recognized her, knew she had witnessed her parents' murder? And how could she possibly explain Scout? Each step brought new doubts, but the alternative, returning to certain death by exposure, drove her forward. 20 yards from the cabin, a figure suddenly emerged from the doorway, silhouetted against the interior light. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepping out apparently to check on his horse. Sarah froze, instinctively dropping to a crouch in the snow. Scout pressed against her legs, a low growl building in his throat. "Shh," she pleaded, placing a hand on his head. If the man heard them or spotted their movement in the snow, everything would be lost. The man turned slowly, scanning the darkness, as if sensing their presence despite the storm's concealment. Sarah held her breath, willing Scout to remain silent beside her. For a terrible moment, she was certain the man was looking directly at them. Then he turned away, patted his horse once more, and retreated back into the cabin, securing the door. Behind him, Sarah released her breath in a cloud of vapor. It was too dangerous. The man had nearly spotted them, and his size alone suggested he could easily overpower her if his intentions proved hostile. Yet they couldn't survive the night without better shelter. Caught between impossible choices, Sarah made a desperate decision. "Wait here," she whispered to Scout, unsure if he would understand or obey, but needing him to remain hidden. She approached the cabin alone, her movements slow and deliberate, both from caution and near-frozen limbs. At the door, she hesitated, glancing back toward where Scout waited in the darkness. Then, gathering what courage remained in her frozen body, she knocked. Morgan approached the fallen men, checking each with professional detachment to confirm. Neither posed further threat. Hammond kept Sarah at a distance, his protective instinct evident in both stance and expression. The canyon's natural acoustics amplified every sound, water flowing across stone, leather creaking as Morgan searched. The bodies, their own measured breathing in the aftermath of violence. "Crawford's men, without question," Morgan announced, holding up papers retrieved from one man's coat. Written instructions regarding our interception. Mentions payment upon confirmation of the girls. He glanced toward Sarah, modifying his intended words. Upon completion of their task. Hammond nodded grimly, unsurprised by this confirmation of their suspicions. Any indication of additional parties searching other routes? Morgan scanned the documents again before responding. References to eastern approach and river crossing, suggesting at least 2 more teams deployed to intercept potential routes to Silver City. He pocketed the papers with practiced efficiency. We should assume we're not the only ones being hunted. The assessment aligned with Crawford's demonstrated resources and determination. A man willing to murder a respected illustrator, and his wife would hardly hesitate to employ multiple teams in preventing testimony that might send him to the gallows. Silver City remained at least a day's journey through difficult terrain, with potential interception points along any logical approach. Options? Hammond asked, deferring again to Morgan's superior wilderness experience. The trapper considered their position with tactical precision. Continue through the canyon, he decided, but split at the southern exit. I'll take the horses east, creating visible trails suggesting all 3 of us travel together. You and the girl proceed directly south through Mitchell Pass. Higher ground, more exposure, but less likely to be watched given the difficulty. Hammond frowned, obvious concern in his expression. Your arm is functional enough for diversion, Morgan interrupted. I'm the better tracker. If anyone follows, I'll know and can lead them further from your actual route. Sarah listened to this exchange with growing understanding of the sacrifice Morgan proposed. With his injured arm, he volunteered to become the primary target, drawing potential pursuers away from her path to testimony. The plan held logical merit, yet represented significant personal risk for the taciturn mountain man who had already endured injury and danger on her behalf. Why are you doing this? She asked directly, unable to reconcile Morgan's continued assistance with his reputation. As a solitary figure who avoided human entanglements, you've already done more than anyone could expect. Morgan's weathered face revealed little, though something shifted in his eyes at the directness of her question. Told you once, he replied after a measured pause. Lost my family years back. Couldn't help them. He glanced at the fallen men, then back to Sarah. Maybe this time I can make a difference. The simple statement conveyed more about Daniel Morgan than all their previous interactions combined. Sarah recognized the motivation driving his actions, not merely assistance to a child in danger, but redemption for past helplessness, for family lost when he couldn't intervene. Her circumstances had provided opportunity to address wounds far older than those visible on his bandaged arm. Before she could respond, Hammond spoke with quiet authority. We accept your plan, he told Morgan. But with modification. We rendezvous at Miller's Ridge, overlooked tomorrow at midday. If you don't appear, we continue to Silver City and send Blackwood's deputies to search for you. Morgan nodded acceptance of these terms, recognizing they balanced operational necessity with reasonable safety measures. With the decision made, they proceeded efficiently, securing items of potential value from the fallen men, retrieving their horses, and removing any evidence that might reveal their planned divergence to subsequent searches. The bodies they left where they had fallen, the wilderness to reclaim in its own time. They continued through Blackwater Canyon with increased vigilance, each member of their small party processing the recent confrontation differently. Hammond maintained practical focus on immediate navigation while planning subsequent stages of their journey. Morgan scanned constantly for signs of additional pursuit, his injured arm seemingly forgotten amid tactical considerations. Sarah found herself caught between analytical understanding of what had occurred and emotional processing of another violent encounter connected to her parents' murder. The canyon gradually widened as they approached its southern terminus, terrain, transitioning from sheer walls to more manageable slopes interspersed with boulder fields and stunted pine growth. Morgan identified the divergence point with experienced precision, a location where multiple game trails offered plausible options for travelers departing the canyon's protection. Mitchell Pass lies 2 miles south, he explained, indicating a distant saddle between sloping ridgelines. Follow the western ridge to avoid exposed traverses. Once across, you'll have clear sight to Silver City Valley. Hammond nodded, committing these instructions to memory while assessing the terrain. With his own experienced eye, he transferred essential supplies from horseback to a small pack he would carry, ensuring he and Sarah could travel efficiently on foot, while Morgan departed with all 3 mounts, creating the impression of their continued group movement. The moment of separation arrived with minimal ceremony, befitting Morgan's taciturn nature. He secured the redistributed supplies across the 3 horses, checked his rifle's loading with mechanical precision, and turned towards Sarah with uncharacteristic awkwardness, as if uncertain how to properly conclude their association. "The valley where Scout lives," Sarah said before he could speak, surprising herself with the question uppermost in her mind, despite present dangers. "Will you check on him again when this is finished?" Morgan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Said I would," he replied simply. "Man keeps his word." The statement contained layers of meaning beyond its surface simplicity, acknowledgement of moral code that had guided his assistants throughout their interactions, recognition of obligation extending beyond current circumstances, promise regarding the animal companion who had shared her wilderness survival. Sarah found herself unexpectedly moved by this gruff commitment from a man who rarely offered unnecessary words. "Thank you," she said, the phrase inadequate yet encompassing everything from his initial shelter during the blizzard to his current sacrifice in drawing danger away from her path. Morgan acknowledged her gratitude with a short nod, uncomfortable with emotional display, yet unwilling to dismiss its legitimacy. He turned to Hammond, exchanging brief handshakes and final coordination details before mounting his horse with careful movements that minimized strain on his injured arm. "Miller's Ridge," he confirmed. "Midday tomorrow." With that sparse farewell, Morgan departed eastward from the canyon's mouth, leading the 2 riderless horses in a visible formation that would clearly indicate 3 travelers to any pursuing parties. Sarah watched until distance and terrain obscured his silhouette, aware that she might never see the solitary trapper again, despite the planned rendezvous. Morgan had chosen to place himself directly in harm's way, creating deliberate vulnerability. To protect her path to testimony, Hammond allowed her this moment of acknowledgement before gently redirecting their focus to the immediate journey ahead. "We should move while daylight remains," he suggested, securing the small pack containing their essential supplies. "The pass is manageable, but better navigated with proper visibility." Sarah nodded, turning resolutely toward the southern ridgeline Morgan had indicated. Her wilderness experiences had prepared her for the physical demands of their current situation, traveling on foot through challenging terrain without the comforts or safety margin of established trails. What she hadn't anticipated was the emotional complexity accompanying each step away from the man who had volunteered to become a target on her behalf. Hammond set a sustainable pace as they ascended the western approach to Mitchell Pass, selecting routes that balance progress against exposure to potential observation from distant vantage points. The afternoon sun cast their elongated shadows across rocky ground dotted with early spring growth. Hardy alpine plants emerging from winter dormancy with determined resilience that resonated with Sarah's own circumstances. They paused briefly, near a sheltered outcropping that offered momentary rest without compromising their security. Hammond studied the terrain ahead with experienced assessment, identifying the most efficient route toward the pass while remaining vigilant for any sign of human presence beyond their small party. Sarah drank sparingly from their limited water supply, her wilderness experiences having instilled disciplined resource management regardless of immediate comfort. "Morgan will create an effective diversion," Hammond observed, correctly interpreting her periodic glances toward the eastern horizon where their companion had disappeared. "He knows these mountains better than almost anyone." Sarah nodded, recognizing the reassurance while maintaining realistic perspective. "He's injured and outnumbered," she noted, unwilling to accept comfortable illusions given the stakes involved. "And Crawford seems willing to employ as many men as necessary." Hammond acknowledged her assessment with respectful seriousness rather than dismissive comfort. "True on both counts," he agreed, "but underestimating Daniel Morgan has proven fatal for many who've tried." He gestured toward the pass, still requiring substantial ascent. "Our best support is completing this journey successfully, making his risk worthwhile." The observation redirected Sarah's focus appropriately. Each step toward Silver City and formal testimony represented progress toward the justice her parents deserved, the purpose that had sustained her through wilderness survival, unexpected companionship with Scout, and now this final journey toward legal proceedings. Morgan had volunteered to create space for this completion. Honoring his sacrifice meant using that space effectively. They resumed their ascent with renewed determination, Hammond leading through increasingly rocky terrain that required occasional use of hands alongside careful foot placement. Sarah followed with surprising agility, her months in wilderness environments having developed physical capabilities beyond typical for her age and background. The challenges of this controlled climb seemed almost manageable compared to her desperate flight from her burning home, her subsequent struggle to survive winter conditions with minimal resources. Late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across Mitchell Pass as they approached its highest point, the saddle between ridgelines offering brief respite from continuous ascent. Hammond guided them to a position just below the actual crest, silhouetting against the skyline while still providing perspective on the terrain ahead. From this vantage point, they could see portions of the valley beyond, rolling foothills gradually descending toward distant Silver City, still invisible beyond intervening terrain, but represented by faint smudges of smoke on the horizon. "We'll cross the pass at dusk," Hammond decided, assessing the remaining daylight. "Travel through early evening hours, when visibility favors us over potential observers. Find suitable shelter for few hours rest, then complete the approach before dawn." The plan balanced security concerns against physical limitations, recognizing that exhaustion created its own vulnerabilities, regardless of external threats. Sarah acknowledged the wisdom of this approach, tempering eagerness to reach their destination with practical recognition of requirements for successful arrival. She had learned patience through necessity during her wilderness survival. Applying that discipline to their current circumstances presented little difficulty. As shadows lengthened across the landscape, Hammond led them carefully across Mitchell Pass itself, maintaining vigilant watch for any sign of human presence while selecting routes offering maximum concealment. The crossing proceeded without incident, allowing them to begin descent along the southern slope as twilight settled over the mountains. Stars emerged in the darkening sky, familiar constellations that had guided Sarah through her initial wilderness journey, now presiding over this final approach to justice and resolution. Hammond identified a suitable resting location several hours into their descent, a small depression sheltered by boulder formations that offered protection from both observation and strengthening night winds. They settled into this minimal camp with wilderness efficiency, consuming cold rations while maintaining hushed conversation relevant to their continued journey. "We should reach Silver City by mid-morning," Hammond estimated. "Directly to Blackwood's office, avoiding public visibility until proper protection can be arranged." Sarah nodded, considering the implications of their imminent arrival. "Will Crawford know I've reached town before the formal testimony?" "Possibly," Hammond acknowledged. "He has resources throughout the region, likely including informants among Silver City's population." He studied her expression in the dim starlight. "Does that concern you?" "Only for practical planning," Sarah replied, with composure that reflected her growth throughout these experiences. "Understanding his potential awareness affects security considerations, preparation for testimony." Hammond nodded approvingly at this analytical response rather than emotional reaction. "Blackwood will establish appropriate protections once we reach his jurisdiction. Crawford's influence has limits, particularly regarding direct action against a witness under official protection." Sarah accepted this assessment while maintaining realistic perspective developed through months of challenging circumstances. Crawford had already demonstrated willingness to employ violence when his interests were threatened, first against her parents, then against those assisting her journey toward testimony. Official protection represented improved security rather than absolute safety, a distinction she understood through hard-earned experience. "Rest while you can," Hammond advised, recognizing the fatigue evident beneath her composed exterior. "I'll keep watch, wake you when we need to move." Sleep arrived with surprising ease despite their circumstances, Sarah's body accepting available rest regardless of discomfort or lingering concerns. Her dreams cycled through fragments of recent experiences. Scout disappearing into forest shadows, Morgan riding eastward with deliberate visibility, her parents' faces illuminated by firelight on evenings before violence shattered their family existence. These images flowed with dream logic connectivity, emotional resonance transcending chronological sequence or physical plausibility. Hammond's gentle touch on her shoulder roused Sarah from these fragmented visions, the landscape around them, now illuminated by pre-dawn light, sufficient for careful movement through unfamiliar terrain. They resumed their journey with minimal conversation, conscious of sound carrying across open slopes as they descended toward more populated regions surrounding Silver City. Morning sunlight gradually revealed the landscape's transition from wilderness to human influence, distant fenced properties becoming visible, occasional structures marking outskirts of settled areas, thin trails widening into more established paths. Hammond adjusted their route to maintain maximum concealment while progressing efficiently toward their destination, balancing security concerns against the importance of reaching Blackwood's protection as quickly as practicable. By mid-morning, Silver City itself came into view, a substantial frontier settlement nestled in the valley below, its development more extensive than Sarah had observed during her previous brief visit. Multiple streets formed a rough grid pattern, surrounded by scattered outlying properties, the central business district identifiable through larger structures and increased activity, visible even at this distance. "Marshal's office stands near the northern edge," Hammond indicated, pointing toward a distinctive building flying territorial flags. "We'll approach from this direction, minimizing transit through populated areas." The strategy reflected continued caution despite their proximity to official protection. Sarah appreciated Hammond's thoroughness, while simultaneously experiencing growing anticipation regarding their arrival. Not merely reaching safety after a challenging journey, but approaching the culmination of purposes that had sustained her. Through months of disruption and adaptation, They traverse the final distance between wilderness and settlement with heightened vigilance, Hammond selecting routes that utilized available cover while maintaining reasonably direct approach to Blackwood's jurisdiction. Sarah remained close beside her guardian, conscious that proximity to civilization potentially increased danger rather than diminishing it, given Crawford's demonstrated resources and determination. When they finally reached the marshal's office, Hammond insisted on entering alone initially, positioning Sarah in concealment nearby while he confirmed Blackwood's presence and established secure introduction. She waited with practiced patience, observing the frontier town's routine activities from her sheltered vantage point. Merchants arranging displays, freight wagons delivering supplies, ordinary citizens conducting daily business without awareness of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her to this moment. Hammond emerged from the building minutes later, accompanied by Marshal Blackwood himself, both men scanning surroundings with professional vigilance before signaling Sarah to approach. She moved quickly across the short, exposed distance, Blackwood's expression registering momentary surprise at her appearance. Not the traumatized child perhaps expected, but a composed young woman whose wilderness experiences had forged unexpected maturity alongside physical resilience. "Miss Miller," the marshal greeted her with formal respect. "Your arrival is unexpected but exceptionally welcome. Please come inside where we can ensure proper security." The marshal's office interior presented stark contrast to wilderness, environments that had dominated Sarah's recent existence. Solid walls instead of forest canopy, wooden floors replacing uneven ground, furnishings arranged with geometric precision unlike nature's organic variability. The transition felt momentarily disorienting, despite her previous brief exposure to town environments during earlier visit with Hammond. Blackwood guided them to a private office separated from the main operational area, closing the door before addressing the circumstances of their arrival. "Hammond's explained your unexpected route and timing," he began, offering Sarah a chair that she accepted with polite composure. "Also mentioned trouble encountered along the way. Morgan? Creating diversion eastward," Hammond replied, summarizing their separation arrangement and planned rendezvous. 2 of Crawford's men neutralized in Blackwater Canyon. Documents indicating additional teams deployed along alternate approaches. Blackwood absorbed this information with professional gravity, his expression reflecting both concern regarding the tactical situation and appreciation for their successful navigation through established threats. "Crawford's grown increasingly desperate as trial approaches," he observed, evidence mounting beyond his ability to influence through conventional channels. Sarah listened to this exchange with focused attention, connecting these developments to experiences throughout her journey from orphaned flight to present moment. Crawford's escalating tactics confirmed the significance of her testimony and her father's documentation, the combination representing genuine threat to operations that had previously proceeded with relative impunity. "I should send deputies and to your rendezvous point," Blackwood suggested. "Provide support for Morgan if he successfully evades pursuit." Hammond nodded agreement. "Miller's Ridge overlook midday. Morgan's capable, but his injury creates vulnerability despite his wilderness skills." As these tactical discussions proceeded, Sarah found her attention drawn briefly to the office window overlooking Silver City's main street. Ordinary life continued beyond the glass, people moving with purposeful routines, unaware of the extraordinary circumstances and sacrifices that had brought her to this moment of approaching justice. Her parents had been similarly engaged in routine existence before violence shattered their lives, their murder connected to principles and documentation that now approached formal judicial process. "Miss Miller," Blackwood addressed her directly, recapturing her attention. Your formal testimony remains scheduled 4 days hence, when the circuit judge arrives for Crawford's proceedings. Until then, we'll establish secure accommodations with continuous protection." His expression softened slightly. "Your courage throughout these events has been remarkable. Few adults would have managed what you've accomplished." Sarah acknowledged this assessment with simple dignity rather than false modesty. "I had help," she replied, thinking of Scout's companionship during her initial wilderness survival, Morgan's intervention during the blizzard, Hammond's guidance throughout subsequent events. "Important purposes provide necessary strength." Blackwood nodded, recognizing wisdom beyond expected for her years, perspective forged through extraordinary circumstances rather than ordinary development. "Arrangements are being prepared," he continued, returning to practical matters. "Deputy Wilkins will escort you to secure lodging once preparations are complete. Meanwhile, refreshment would seem appropriate after your journey." The marshal's suggestion prompted recognition of physical needs, temporarily superseded by security considerations and formal interactions. Sarah accepted offered water with genuine appreciation, the simple comfort representing transition from wilderness survival to civilization's amenities, despite continued awareness of surrounding circumstances. Hammond provided additional details regarding their journey, while Blackwood's staff prepared appropriate accommodations, information necessary for both immediate security and subsequent testimony. Sarah contributed precise observations regarding the confrontation in Blackwater Canyon, descriptions of men encountered there confirming their connection to individuals identified in her father's documentation. "The one I recognized," she explained with composed clarity. "He was present during the attack on our cabin. I saw his profile illuminated by firelight when—" She paused briefly, maintaining factual focus despite emotional associations. "When my mother directed me toward the escape tunnel." Blackwood recorded this information with professional thoroughness, recognizing its significance for connecting Crawford directly to the original violence rather than merely subsequent attempts to prevent testimony. "Your observations provide crucial links in establishing chain of responsibility," he noted. "Combined with your father's documentation, they create compelling case against both direct perpetrators and those who directed their actions." Before further discussion could develop, rapid footsteps approached Blackwood's office door, accompanied by urgent voices. The marshal rose immediately, hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm as the door opened without customary courtesy. Deputy Wilkins appeared in the doorway, his expression conveying urgency without specific explanation. "Marshal," he began, slightly breathless from apparent hurried arrival. "Riders approaching from the northern ridge. 3 horses, 2 carrying bodies draped over saddles. Single rider appears injured but conscious." Hammond stood immediately, exchanging meaningful glances with Sarah as they processed identical conclusion. "Morgan," he stated with certainty tinged by concern, "the rendezvous wasn't scheduled until tomorrow." Blackwood responded with decisive efficiency, issuing rapid instructions to assembled deputies. "Wilkins, secure the street between here and the northern approach. Reynolds, Johnson, armed escort to intercept these riders and provide immediate assistance. Harrison, alert the doctor to prepare for potential treatment of serious injuries." Activity exploded around them as deputies moved to execute these directives, professional response to unexpected development rather than disordered reaction. Hammond stepped toward the window overlooking the northern approach to Silver City, Sarah joining him, despite Blackwood's momentary hesitation regarding her exposure. From this vantage point, they could indeed observe distant figures descending the final slope toward town. 3 horses moving at careful pace, the lead animal carrying an upright rider, while 2 followers bore distinctive burdens draped across their saddles. Even at this distance, the lead rider's posture suggested injury or exhaustion, body positioned with obvious effort to maintain control of all 3 mounts. "It's Morgan," Hammond confirmed. Recognition evident despite intervening. Distance. Appears he encountered additional opposition after our separation. Sarah absorbed this assessment with complex emotions. Relief regarding Morgan's survival juxtaposed against concern for his evident condition, appreciation for his successful navigation to Silver City despite obstacles previously identified. The bodies across accompanying horses suggested further violence following their separation, additional confrontation with Crawford's deployed agents. Blackwood organized immediate response, dispatching deputies to provide escort and assist Morgan's final approach to town jurisdiction. "We'll receive him directly here," the marshal determined. "Secure statement and evidence while providing necessary medical attention." Sarah watched from the office window as events unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Marshal Blackwood's deputies intercepting Morgan's approaching party with professional coordination that provided both assistance and security. The distance prevented detailed observation of Morgan's condition, though his continued upright position suggested injuries manageable despite obvious discomfort. "He deliberately diverted potential pursuit," Hammond observed, interpreting available evidence with experienced assessment, likely encountered additional opposition beyond those documented in our possession, yet still managed to neutralize threats and reach Silver City directly rather than awaiting scheduled rendezvous. The observation highlighted Morgan's exceptional capabilities despite his injured condition. Wilderness skills combined with tactical judgment that had successfully navigated life-threatening circumstances while maintaining focus on ultimate objective, ensuring Sarah's safe arrival for testimony against Crawford. His actions represented commitment beyond contractual obligation or casual assistance. Sacrifice motivated by principles rarely articulated but consistently demonstrated. As Morgan's party approached the marshal's office under deputy escort, details became visible that confirmed Hammond's assessment while adding concerning elements. The trapper's original arm injury had been supplemented by what appeared to be additional damage to his left leg, makeshift bandaging visible even from their elevated vantage point. His posture suggested significant discomfort maintained through sheer determination rather than physical stability. Despite these conditions, he managed his horses with practiced control while maintaining vigilant observation of surroundings. The bodies across accompanying mounts wore clothing consistent with frontier operators rather than ordinary travelers or settlers, further confirming their identity as Crawford's deployed agents intercepted during Morgan's diversionary movement. Their presence represented both tactical success regarding the trapper's mission and sobering evidence of Crawford's extensive resources deployed against Sarah's potential testimony. 4 confirmed neutralized, Hammond noted, counting casualties from both their canyon encounter and Morgan's subsequent engagement. Potentially more depending on circumstances following our separation. Crawford committed significant resources to preventing your appearance at trial. Sarah nodded, recognizing implications regarding both the effectiveness of their unconventional approach to Silver City and the value Crawford placed on silencing her testimony. Her father's documentation combined with eyewitness account of actual murderers created legal vulnerability that apparently justified extensive deployment of resources and personnel, confirmation regarding the significance of justice now approaching fulfillment. Morgan disappeared from view as deputies assisted his dismount directly below their vantage point, his entry to the marshal's office occurring outside their immediate observation. Blackwood moved to receive this unexpected arrival, indicating Hammond and Sarah should remain temporarily in the private office, while initial assessment and security procedures were completed. They complied with this reasonable precaution, though Sarah found herself unexpectedly anxious to confirm Morgan's condition directly rather than through second-hand reports or distant observation. Minutes stretched uncomfortably before Blackwood returned, accompanied by a deputy physically supporting Morgan into the office space. The trapper's condition confirmed concerns visible from distant observation. His original arm injury supplemented by significant damage to his left thigh, both bandaged with field expedients that had prevented catastrophic blood loss while providing minimal actual treatment. Despite these obvious injuries, Morgan maintained composed awareness of surroundings, his expression revealing recognition as he identified Sarah's presence within the secured location. "Made it," he stated simply, the sparse phrase encompassing both tactical report and personal acknowledgement of Sarah's successful arrival preceding his own. "Doctor's been summoned," Blackwood informed them, directing his deputy to assist Morgan into the most comfortable available chair. "Meanwhile, basic treatment supplies are being gathered. Your statement can wait until immediate medical concerns are addressed." Morgan shook his head with characteristic stubbornness. "Statement first," he insisted, "while details remain clear." The marshal started to object before recognizing determination unlikely to yield to conventional medical prioritization. With practiced efficiency, he arranged documentation materials, while his deputy provided water and rudimentary comfort measures without disrupting Morgan's focus on delivering critical information. 3 additional men beyond those encountered in the canyon, Morgan reported, his typically sparse communication style unaffected by physical discomfort. "Positioned along eastern approach as expected. Intercepted approximately 4 miles from our separation point." He described subsequent events with tactical precision, his detection of the waiting party, deliberate approach that maintained appearance of 3 travelers while actually providing advantageous engagement positioning. The confrontation that followed when ambush parameters were disrupted by his unexpected tactical adjustments. Despite numerical disadvantage and his existing injury, Morgan had neutralized the immediate threat through combination of wilderness knowledge, tactical experience, and sheer determination fueled by purpose beyond personal survival. 2 eliminated. During direct engagement, he reported with professional detachment that acknowledged human consequences without emotional entanglement. 3rd wounded, but escaped initial encounter, tracked him until approaching nightfall when visibility permitted final resolution. The clinical description conveyed necessary information while avoiding gratuitous details regarding violent resolution required by circumstances. Sarah listened with mature comprehension beyond her years, connecting Morgan's experiences to broader pattern of escalation demonstrated throughout Crawford's attempts to prevent testimony threatening his operations. And freedom. Bodies recovered for identification purposes, Morgan concluded, gesturing toward the marshal's window, indicating horses visible outside the office. Documentation retrieved matches materials found during canyon encounter. Consistent formats, payment structures, operational parameters. Blackwood recorded this information with professional thoroughness, recognizing its significance for both immediate security assessment and subsequent legal proceedings. Crawford's direct connection to these deployment instructions provides additional evidence regarding orchestrated violence beyond wildlife poaching operations, he observed. Combined with Miss Miller's testimony and original documentation, establishes patterns suggesting premeditated homicide rather than situational violence. Morgan acknowledged this assessment with minimal movement, conservation of energy reflecting both physical condition and characteristic communication efficiency. His gaze shifted briefly towards Sarah, something uncharacteristically expressive visible in his typically guarded features. "Worth it," he stated simply, the sparse phrase encompassing judgment regarding both tactical operation and personal sacrifice. Involved. Before Sarah could respond to this unexpected expression of values, typically left unspoken, medical intervention arrived in form of the town doctor, accompanied by additional supplies and assistance. Blackwood temporarily suspended formal statement-taking to allow immediate treatment of injuries that had been subordinated to operational reporting, despite their obvious severity. "We'll continue documentation once initial treatment is completed," the marshal determined, arranging appropriate clearing of space for medical procedures. Deputy Harrison will escort Miss Miller and Mr. Hammond to secured accommodations prepared during these developments. Morgan's expression suggested potential objection to this separation before practical assessment appeared to override instinctive response. His nod conveyed acceptance of reasonable security procedures alongside recognition of Sarah's continued safety within established protective parameters. The connection established through shared wilderness experiences and subsequent events remained acknowledged, despite transition to more conventional protective arrangements. As Deputy Harrison prepared to escort them from the marshal's office towards secured accommodations elsewhere in Silver City, Sarah approached Morgan briefly, conscious of both propriety expectations and genuine sentiment requiring expression despite surrounding formality. "Thank you," she stated with simple dignity, matching the trapper's own communication style, "for everything." Morgan met her gaze directly, something softening in his weathered features despite physical discomfort and surrounding circumstances. "You survived," he replied, the observation encompassing assessment beyond immediate tactical success. "That's what matters." The exchange contained layers of meaning transcending its surface simplicity, acknowledgement of journey from desperate wilderness flight to present moment of approaching justice, recognition of growth forged through extraordinary circumstances, appreciation for connections established despite unlikely parameters. Sarah nodded once, accepting both expressed sentiment and underlying significance without requiring additional articulation, unsuited to either Morgan's nature or present surroundings. Deputy Harrison guided Sarah and Hammond from the marshal's office through carefully secured routes toward accommodations established for remaining days preceding formal testimony. Silver City continued normal operations around them. Citizens engaged in routine activities without awareness of extraordinary circumstances and sacrifices culminating in their midst. The contrast between ordinary existence and Sarah's experiences created momentary dissonance, perspective developed through wilderness survival and subsequent events providing unusual context for observing conventional civilization. Their designated lodging occupied upper floors of a substantial building near the town center, its position selected for both defensibility and proximity to the courthouse where formal proceedings would occur. Multiple deputies maintained continuous presence around the perimeter, Blackwood having established security protocols reflecting Crawford's demonstrated willingness to employ violence against potential testimony threatening his operations and freedom. Hammond remained with Sarah throughout these arrangements, his guardianship encompassing both legal responsibility and personal commitment developed through shared experiences since her arrival at his mining claim months earlier. Their conversations, during initial settlement into secured accommodations, reflected practical consideration of upcoming events, while acknowledging emotional significance of approaching resolution. "Your testimony occurs in 4 days, Hammond noted as they assessed the comfortable but functional rooms assigned for their protection, and Blackwood will arrange formal preparation sessions preceding the actual proceedings, ensuring you understand procedural expectations without compromising authentic reporting of witnessed events." Sarah nodded, accepting this reasonable approach. To structuring her participation in legal processes unfamiliar, despite their critical importance to justice for her parents. "Will Morgan recover sufficiently to provide his own testimony?" she asked, concern evident despite her typical composure. His injuries appeared significant but not immediately life-threatening with proper treatment. Hammond assessed based on observations during their brief interaction. Blackwood will ensure appropriate medical attention while maintaining security parameters around all witnesses connected to Crawford's case. The response provided factual assessment without offering false reassurance regarding Morgan's condition or potential complications arising from field treatment and delayed medical intervention. Sarah appreciated this honest approach, having developed clear preference for difficult truth over comforting illusions throughout her extraordinary experiences. Since her parents' murder, 4 days stretched before them. Preparation for testimony, continued security measures, anticipation of formal proceedings that would determine consequences for those responsible for violence that had orphaned her and sent her fleeing into wilderness that simultaneously threatened survival and provided unexpected connection through Scout's companionship. The approaching resolution carried significance transcending individual circumstances, potential justice for broader patterns of exploitation and violence perpetrated by Crawford's operations throughout the territory. Evening settled over Silver City as Sarah stood near the window of their secured accommodations, observing the town's transition from daily commerce to quieter, nighttime rhythms. Lamps illuminated major streets, while smaller pathways faded into darkness. Citizens completing final errands before returning to homes scattered throughout the valley. The scene presented stark contrast to wilderness environments that had dominated her recent existence. Human organization imposing geometric patterns upon natural landscape, artificial light creating boundaries against surrounding darkness. Different perspective than wilderness nights, Hammond observed, joining her briefly at the window while maintaining appropriate distance from potential observation from below. Stars less visible, but human connection more apparent. Sarah considered this assessment thoughtfully, connecting present circumstances to experiences that had shaped her understanding since fleeing her burning home. Different strengths in each environment, she replied. Wilderness taught survival through immediate challenges. Civilization offers justice through collective action. Hammond nodded appreciation for this mature observation, recognizing wisdom developed through extraordinary circumstances rather than ordinary developmental progression. Your parents believed in both, he noted gently. Your father documented wilderness with artist's precision while advocating for its protection through civilized legal structures. Your mother taught you both wilderness skills and principles, requiring societal enforcement. The observation provided framework for understanding her parents' lives beyond their tragic ending, contextualizing their choices and principles within broader relationship between wilderness and civilization, rather than arbitrary opposition. Sarah found unexpected comfort in this perspective. Her journey from desperate flight through wilderness survival toward approaching testimony represented continuation of values they had embodied, rather than mere consequence of violence that had separated them. As night deepened over Silver City, Sarah retired to accommodations more comfortable than any she had experienced since her family's cabin, yet strangely unfamiliar after months of adaptation to wilderness environments and mining camp functionalities. Sleep arrived gradually, her mind processing transitions between survival contexts alongside anticipation of approaching testimony that would connect past violence to future consequences through present legal procedures. The 4 days preceding formal proceedings passed with structured efficiency under Marshal Blackwood's organized protocols. Sarah received appropriate preparation regarding courtroom procedures and testimony expectations while maintaining authentic recollection of witnessed events. Hammond remained present throughout these preparations, providing both practical guidance and emotional support as she prepared to publicly recount experiences carrying significant trauma beneath their factual parameters. Information regarding Morgan's condition arrived through official channels rather than direct interaction, security protocols maintaining separation between witnesses until formal proceedings. The trapper had indeed suffered significant injuries during his diversionary operation, though medical intervention appeared successful in addressing immediate concerns without life-threatening complications. His own testimony had been documented through formal deposition that would be presented during court proceedings, arrangement reflecting both physical limitations and security considerations. Crawford himself remained in custody throughout these preparations, his financial resources and regional influence insufficient to secure release, given the severity of charges and substantial evidence accumulated against both his direct actions and broader criminal enterprise. Reports suggested increasing isolation, as previously loyal associates recognized potential advantages in providing testimony against their employer in exchange for consideration regarding their own legal vulnerabilities. On the morning scheduled for Sarah's formal testimony, Blackwood himself arrived to escort her from secured accommodations to the courthouse where proceedings had been underway for 2 days prior. The marshal's personal involvement signified both the importance attached to her testimony and continued security concerns, despite Crawford's custody and disruption of his deployed agents. The courthouse stood at Silver City's center, its stone construction and formal architecture distinguishing it from surrounding wooden structures. Citizens gathered outside despite early hour, word having spread regarding the orphaned girl's testimony against Crawford. Sarah walked between Hammond and Marshal Blackwood with composed dignity, her simple but proper clothing provided by the Marshal's wife, creating appropriate appearance for formal proceedings while bearing little resemblance to the wilderness-adapted girl who had survived alongside a bear cub. Inside, the courtroom presented imposing formality, polished wooden barriers separating spectator areas from procedural spaces, the judge's elevated bench dominating proceedings from the front, jury box positioned to observe all testimony with appropriate perspective. Sarah noted these details with calm awareness, her extraordinary experiences having developed capacity for observation even amid emotionally significant circumstances. Crawford occupied the defendant's position, his formerly commanding presence diminished by custody and mounting evidence against both wildlife poaching operations and connected murders. His gaze followed Sarah's entrance, calculation visible beneath superficial composure as he assessed this crucial witness whose survival and testimony represented substantial threat to his freedom and future. Judge Harmon Richardson presided, with formal authority amplified by the territorial governor's presence among distinguished observers. The proceedings followed established protocols, Sarah's oath administered with appropriate solemnity before questioning began regarding events, beginning with the attack on her family's homestead. She recounted these experiences with remarkable clarity, her testimony combining precise observation with emotional authenticity that captivated the crowded courtroom. "I saw 3 men clearly in the firelight," she explained, maintaining composed delivery despite painful content. "One was Crawford himself, directing the others while remaining outside. 2 entered our cabin after breaking down the door. The 3rd remained with the horses." Her identification of Crawford directly present during the attack created observable reaction throughout the courtroom. This connection between wealthy businessmen and actual violence representing crucial evidence regarding premeditated murder, rather than incidental conflict. The defendant's expression hardened as this testimony undermined potential defense strategies involving delegation of responsibilities to subordinates without direct knowledge. Sarah continued through sequential events. Her escape through the cellar tunnel, desperate flight into wilderness, subsequent survival challenges including initial encounter with Scout. She described these extraordinary experiences with straightforward authenticity, neither minimizing survival accomplishments nor embellishing for dramatic effect. The courtroom remained remarkably silent throughout this testimony, spectators transfixed by both content and the composed young witness delivering experiences beyond normal childhood parameters. Crawford's attorney attempted cross-examination with professional determination, despite mounting evidence against his client. His questions sought to undermine Sarah's identification of Crawford at the murder scene, suggesting darkness and trauma might have affected accurate recognition. "You were frightened, hiding, observing through limited perspective," he suggested, with practiced persuasiveness. "How can you be certain the man you glimpsed was indeed Mr. Crawford rather than someone of similar build or appearance?" Sarah considered the question with appropriate seriousness rather than defensive reaction. "Because I had seen Mr. Crawford previously, when he visited our homestead 6 months earlier," she replied with simple certainty. "He came to offer my father employment, creating illustrations for his hunting expeditions. They argued when my father realized Crawford's actual business involved poaching rather than legitimate hunting. This revelation introduced additional evidence regarding motive and premeditation beyond information previously established during proceedings." Crawford's expression betrayed momentary shock that this encounter had been witnessed and remembered, this unexpected testimony further connecting him directly to subsequent violence rather than through intermediary agents. When questioning concluded, Judge Richardson commended Sarah's testimony with formal acknowledgement, unusual within procedural parameters. "The court recognizes extraordinary courage demonstrated by this witness," he stated for official record, "both during the traumatic events described and in providing this testimony despite continuing threats against her safety." Sarah returned to protective custody following her court appearance, Hammond accompanying her while Marshal Blackwood remained for subsequent proceedings. Their secured accommodations maintained separation from public accessibility, though reports arrived periodically regarding courtroom developments following her crucial testimony. "The jury deliberated less than 2 hours," Blackwood informed them upon returning that evening. "Verdict delivered on all counts. Guilty of orchestrating wildlife poaching operations, guilty of first-degree murder regarding Thomas and Elizabeth Miller, guilty of attempted murder regarding Sarah Miller, and others assisting her testimony." The comprehensive verdict represented full accountability for Crawford's criminal enterprise, justice encompassing both wildlife exploitation and human victims claimed through violence protecting these operations. Sarah received this information with complex emotions, satisfaction regarding official acknowledgement of her parents' murder, alongside recognition that legal proceedings could never fully restore what had been lost. "Sentencing occurs tomorrow," Blackwood continued. "Given the multiple murder convictions, hanging appears certain outcome. The governor's presence throughout proceedings indicates territorial authorities intend this case to establish clear consequences for similar operations throughout the region." The marshal's assessment confirmed broader significance beyond individual justice, Crawford's case establishing legal precedent regarding accountability for wealthy individuals directing criminal activities while maintaining public respectability. Thomas Miller's documentation combined with Sarah's testimony had created compelling evidence impossible to dismiss, despite the defendant's substantial resources and regional influence. "What happens afterward?" Sarah asked, the question encompassing her own future beyond these immediate proceedings. "Where do I go once this concludes?" Hammond answered with gentle certainty. "You have permanent home with me as promised, whether at the mining claim or elsewhere, as your education and development might benefit." He hesitated briefly before adding, "Though I expect you might someday wish to revisit certain wilderness areas when circumstances permit." The reference to potential future connection with locations holding particular significance, including the remote valley where Scout continued his development toward adult bear existence, provided perspective beyond current proceedings. Sarah nodded appreciation for both immediate certainty and acknowledgement of potential future chapters extending beyond present resolution. Morning brought news that Morgan had recovered sufficiently to attend sentencing proceedings despite medical recommendations for continued rest. His determination to witness justice completed matched patterns established throughout his involvement, commitment extending beyond reasonable expectations, principles rarely articulated verbally, yet consistently demonstrated through actions transcending self-interest. The courtroom filled beyond capacity for Crawford's sentencing, territorial citizens recognizing historic significance alongside personal interest in proceedings that had captured regional attention. Sarah entered with the same composed dignity, displayed during testimony, though her attention immediately located Morgan, positioned near the rear entrance, his injured condition evident despite efforts toward formal presentation appropriate for court attendance. Judge Richardson delivered sentencing with formal authority, reflective of proceedings' significance beyond individual case parameters. Maxwell Crawford, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of premeditated murder, attempted murder, and orchestrating extensive wildlife poaching operations, destroying natural resources belonging to all citizens of this territory. His expression conveyed appropriate severity, matching crimes established through evidence and testimony. For these crimes, this court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days of this proceeding. Crawford received this pronouncement with the first genuine emotional display witnessed throughout proceedings, composure fracturing into visible rage directed primarily towards Sarah's position in the courtroom. Their conversation concluded with mutual respect, transcending conventional parameters, connection established through extraordinary circumstances rather than typical social interactions. Morgan departed with characteristic efficiency of movement. Despite ongoing injury recovery, his return to wilderness environments representing continuation of established patterns rather than disruption through recent events, regardless of their significance. Sarah watched his departure with Hammond's supportive presence nearby, her expression reflecting both appreciation for Morgan's contributions throughout these events and awareness regarding continued life development beyond current resolution. Justice for her parents had been secured through legal proceedings. Her own survival had transitioned from desperate necessity toward established future arrangements. Scout continued development toward adult existence within wilderness parameters, appropriate to his species. The extraordinary journey from orphaned flight through wilderness survival alongside unlikely companion toward justice through formal testimony had reached appropriate conclusion, though Sarah recognized life rarely provides absolute endings, rather than transitions between chapters containing both closures and new beginnings within continuous development. "Ready?" Hammond asked gently, indicating their own departure preparations toward future arrangements, including both mining claim, residence and potential educational opportunities supporting her continued development. Sarah nodded, accepting movement towards subsequent life chapters, while maintaining appreciation for experiences and connections that had shaped her journey from desperate flight toward present resolution. Her parents' legacy continued through justice secured. Scout's existence proceeded toward natural fulfillment. Her own development incorporated extraordinary experiences within continuing life progression. She stepped forward with Hammond beside her, moving toward future possibilities with composure forged through wilderness survival, unlikely companionship, and justice secured through determined persistence despite extraordinary challenges encountered. Throughout this remarkable journey, Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.